But I don't want to be like you. The sentence hung in the stagnant air of the hallway, heavier than the metal lockers lining the walls. It was spoken softly, barely a whisper, but in the ecosystem of the 8th grade, it sounded like a gunshot. Amelia stood with her back against the cool metal of locker 314, her knuckles white as she clutched her binder. Facing her was Chloe, the architect of every social nightmare in the district. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was terrified. In that moment, Amelia had quietly committed the ultimate crime. She had refused the crown. To understand the gravity of that refusal, you have to understand the world Amelia lived in. For 3 years, she had perfected the art of being invisible. She wasn't an outcast exactly. She was a ghost. She moved through the corridors like a shadow, hugging the walls, her eyes always lowered just enough to avoid contact, but raised enough to navigate the treacherous currents of the passing periods. She had learned early on that attention was dangerous. If you were seen, you could be judged. If you were judged, you could be discarded. So, Amelia became an observer. She watched the complex machinery of middle school social dynamics with the detached fascination of a scientist studying a volatile chemical reaction. At the center of this volatile reaction was always Chloe. Chloe didn't just attend the school, she owned the atmosphere. She dictated the unspoken dress codes, the acceptable slang, and the precise volume of laughter allowed at the crowded lunch tables. Her influence was a tangible force, a gravity that pulled everyone into her orbit or crushed them if they resisted. For most girls, being noticed by Chloe was the only validation that mattered. It was the difference between existing and living. But Amelia saw something else. From her vantage point in the corners and the back rows, she saw the exhaustion in Chloe's lieutenants. She saw the constant, frantic maintenance required to keep the mask in place. Amelia's sanctuary was a beat-up sketchbook with a fraying cardboard cover. While the rest of the grade fought for position, Amelia fought for perspective. In those pages, the terrifying reality of the cafeteria became a series of charcoal studies. She drew the slump of a shoulder, the forced brightness of a smile, the lonely geometry of a student sitting by themselves. Her art wasn't just a hobby, it was her way of processing the noise. It was the only place where she could speak without opening her mouth. She knew the texture of the school better than anyone because she was the only one actually looking at it, rather than looking for her reflection in it. The rules of this hallway ecosystem were written in invisible ink, but the penalties for breaking them were severe. Rule number 1, never deviate from the group consensus. Rule number 2, never show weakness. Rule number 3, never ever imply that Chloe was anything less than perfect. Amelia navigated these rigid laws by simply not playing the game. She was the static in the background, the extra in the movie of Chloe's life. There was a moment, just weeks before the confrontation, that captured this perfectly. A 6th grader had dropped a tray in the cafeteria, the classic nightmare scenario. The crash echoed like a bomb. The room froze. Chloe and her table erupted into that sharp, performative laughter that signals a kill. But in the shadow of that cruelty, Amelia had quietly slid her own napkin dispenser toward the crying girl, shielding her face from the cameras of a dozen prying smartphones. It was a micro moment of grace, entirely unseen by the predators. Chloe didn't see the kindness because she wasn't looking for it. She only looked for weakness. Amelia knew that invisibility was a shield, a cloak that kept her safe from the biting cold of popularity. But the problem with being invisible is that eventually someone decides to turn on a spotlight. And when the light hits you, you have to decide who you're going to be when the shadows are gone. The breach of Amelia's invisibility didn't happen with a shout or a shove. It happened with a compliment. It was a Tuesday afternoon in earth science, the kind of gray, drowsy period where the air smells like floor wax and boredom. The bell had just rung, and Amelia was packing her charcoal pencils into her bag with the precise, hurried movements of someone trying to escape before the hallways clogged. She felt a presence before she saw it, a shift in the air pressure beside her desk, accompanied by the scent of vanilla body spray and expensive shampoo. She looked up, expecting to be asked to move out of the way. Instead, she found herself looking directly into Chloe's eyes. The room went quiet. Not the respectful silence of a library, but the held-breath silence of a savanna when the lion pauses mid-stride. Chloe wasn't looking through Amelia, she was looking at her. It was a gaze of terrifying assessment, like a jeweler inspecting a rough stone that might, with enough cutting, be worth something. "You know," Chloe said, her voice pitched perfectly to be heard by the lingering students, "you actually have really pretty eyes. It's a shame you hide them behind those bangs. You have so much potential." The word hung there. Potential. It was a masterstroke of manipulation. In one sentence, Chloe had insulted Amelia's current reality while offering her a ticket to a better one. For Amelia, who had spent 3 years feeling like a smudge on the background of the school, the sudden warmth of the spotlight was disorienting. It was a seduction. The human heart, no matter how guarded, has a traitorous desire to be chosen. For a split second, the alarm bells ringing in Amelia's mind were drowned out by the sheer, intoxicating rush of being seen. She didn't say thank you, and she didn't say, leave me alone. She just froze, caught in the glare. This was the opening move. Chloe didn't want a friend. She wanted a project, a pet, someone she could mold. The invitation wasn't to join the group as an equal. It was an invitation to be improved. The first test came immediately. It wasn't a request, it was a correction. Chloe reached out, a violation of personal space that was performed with the casual confidence of someone who owns everything she touches, and swept Amelia's heavy, dark bangs off her forehead. Her fingers were cool and manicured. See? Chloe said, turning Amelia's face slightly toward her lieutenants, who were hovering nearby like a Greek chorus. Doesn't she look so much less tired? The other girls nodded in unison, a synchronized wave of affirmation. Totally, one of them said. You have a great face shape. You just need to open it up. Amelia stood there, her face burning, her bangs held hostage by Chloe's hand. This was the moment to pull away. This was the moment to jerk her head back and walk out the door. But she didn't. She stood paralyzed by a confusing cocktail of shame and gratitude. Shame, because she was being discussed like a piece of furniture. Gratitude, because for the first time in her life, the popular girls were looking at her with something other than disdain. They were smiling. It was a predatory smile, sharp at the edges, but to a starving girl, even a poisoned apple looks like food. You should wear it back tomorrow, Chloe said, finally releasing her hand. It was phrased as a suggestion, but the tone was a command. We're all wearing headbands tomorrow. You should too. It would look cute. As the group swept out of the room, leaving a wake of giggles and vanilla scent, Amelia remained by her desk. Her hand went up to her forehead, touching the place where her bangs usually sat. She walked to the small mirror inside the classroom door and pulled her hair back, mimicking what Chloe had done. She looked different, exposed, vulnerable. But also, undeniably, she looked like she belonged to something. She stared at her reflection, trying to reconcile the knot in her stomach with the flutter in her chest. It seemed like kindness. They wanted her to look her best. They wanted her to be part of the we. But as she walked home that afternoon, the feeling settled into something heavier. It felt less like a gift and more like a down payment. She had been given attention, and now she owed them a piece of herself in return. It was the first transaction in an economy she couldn't afford. The headband, as it turned out, was merely the entry fee. The real cost of admission into Chloe's world was paid in installments, deducted from Amelia's soul day by agonizing day. It started with the wardrobe. The comfortable, oversized hoodies that had been Amelia's armor against the world were deemed depressing. The paint-stained jeans that mapped the history of her art projects were sneered at until they stayed buried in the bottom of her drawer. But clothing was easy to change. You can change a shirt without changing your heart. The demands that followed were far more invasive. They wanted inside her head. Chloe didn't just want Amelia to look like them. She wanted Amelia to think like them. Or rather, she wanted Amelia to stop thinking altogether and simply reflect. "Why are you so quiet?" became the group's favorite refrain, asked not with concern, but with suspicion. Silence was dangerous because silence meant you were withholding something. Silence meant you might be judging. So Amelia learned to fill the air with noise. She learned the meaningless chatter of the lunch table, the rapid-fire gossip that didn't actually say anything but served to signal loyalty. She learned to nod when they mocked a teacher's tie. She learned to roll her eyes when a weird kid walked by. Every nod, every eye roll felt like a small betrayal, a tiny scratch on the lens of her conscience. Then came the demand she had dreaded most. It happened on a Thursday, in the crowded hallway between second and third period. Walking toward them was Sarah. Sarah, who had shared her peanut butter sandwiches with Amelia in 4th grade. Sarah, who knew exactly why Amelia hated thunderstorms. Sarah, who was currently wearing a t-shirt featuring a band no one at Chloe's table would ever listen to. Chloe slowed her pace, her arm linking through Amelia's with a possessiveness that felt like handcuffs. "God," Chloe whispered, loud enough to be a command. "She is such a tragedy. You don't actually hang out with her, do you? I mean, look at her. She's social suicide." Sarah saw them. Her face lit up. She raised a hand to wave, her mouth forming Amelia's name. Time seemed to warp, stretching that single second into an eternity. Amelia had a choice. She could wave back. She could acknowledge the history, the kindness, the reality of their friendship. Or she could pay the rent for her new position. Amelia didn't wave. She didn't smile. She looked right through Sarah, fixing her gaze on a point somewhere down the hall, and let Chloe steer her past. She felt the moment Sarah's hand dropped. She felt the confusion on her friend's face radiate like heat. It was a physical blow to the gut, a nausea that rose instantly and tasted like acid. She had just cut away a living part of her past to fit into a future she wasn't even sure she wanted. That night, the transformation reached its terrifying peak in the sanctuary of her bathroom. Amelia stood before the mirror, the fluorescent light humming above her. She wasn't looking at her skin or her hair. She was practicing a sound. She was trying to learn the laugh. You know the one. That sharp, breathless, high-pitched laugh that Chloe used to dismiss anything she found beneath her. It wasn't a laugh of joy. It was a laugh of power. Amelia opened her mouth and tried to force the sound out. It came out strangled, a pathetic croak. She tried again, higher, sharper, crueler. She watched her own face contort into a shape that didn't belong to her. The eyes in the reflection were hers, but the mouth belonged to a stranger. It was a grotesque pantomime. She realized then that she wasn't just changing, she was eroding. To fit into the mold Chloe had cast, Amelia had to shave off every edge that made her real. Her art, her silence, her loyalty, her kindness. They were all weird, and they all had to go. She stopped laughing. The silence of the bathroom rushed back in, heavy and accusing. She looked at the girl in the mirror, the hair pulled back tight, the trendy shirt that felt stiff and wrong, the eyes that looked frightened. She had paid so much already. She had traded her comfort, her voice, and her oldest friend. But the account wasn't settled yet. The pressure in her chest was building to a breaking point, a dense, hot weight that demanded release. She didn't know it yet, but the final bill was about to come due, and the collection agency was waiting by the lockers. Friday arrived with the heaviness of a storm front, the air in the corridors thick with the frantic energy of students desperate to escape into the weekend. But for Amelia, standing at locker 314, the world had narrowed down to a single, suffocating point of focus. She had just opened her metal door, revealing the one thing she had tried to keep separate from her new, curated life, the sketchbook. It was leaning against her history textbook, the spine cracked and white, the cardboard cover fraying at the corners. It was a stark contrast to the glossy perfection she had been trying to emulate for weeks. She reached for it, her fingers needing the comfort of the rough paper, when a shadow fell over her shoulder. It wasn't just a shadow, it was a sudden, sharp drop in temperature. Chloe stood there. She wasn't smiling today. The mask of the benevolent mentor, the one she had worn in earth science and during lunch while correcting Amelia's posture, was gone. In its place was the cold, hard stare of a creditor coming to collect a debt that was past due. She was flanked by her usual entourage, the girls who nodded when she nodded and laughed when she laughed, but they were silent now. They sensed the shift. This wasn't a social call. This was an inspection. Chloe didn't say hello. She didn't ask about Amelia's day. She simply pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the locker's interior. "We need to talk about that," Chloe said, her voice dropping to a register that was intimate and threatening. "I heard you were drawing in the library yesterday. People are talking, Amelia. They're saying you're still doing that." She waved her hand dismissively at the book, as if it were a dirty tissue. "You have to decide. Are you going to be one of us, or are you going to be the weird girl who sketches cartoons in the corner? Because you can't be both. If you want to sit at our table on Monday, that book needs to go in the trash, right now." The demand hung in the air, absolute and non-negotiable. Throw it away. It sounded simple physically, just a movement of the arm, a letting go of the fingers. But to Amelia, it felt like being asked to amputate a limb. That book wasn't just paper and graphite. It was her sanctuary. It was the place where she made sense of the world, where she was powerful, where she was real. To throw it away was to agree that her perspective didn't matter. It was an admission that the core of who she was, the observer, the artist, the quiet thinker, was shameful. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that echoed in her ears like war drums. She looked at the large gray trash can at the end of the hall. It was waiting. Then she looked at Chloe. She saw the expectation in Chloe's eyes, the utter certainty that Amelia would fold. Chloe believed that social acceptance was the ultimate currency, that anyone would pay any price to possess it. And for a moment, Amelia almost did. The fear of exile was a physical pain, a tightening in her throat that made it hard to breathe. But beneath the fear, something else ignited. A small, hot spark of indignation. Why was her joy offensive? Why was her talent a liability? She looked at Chloe, really looked at her, and saw not a queen, but a tyrant scared of anything she couldn't control. The realization hit her with the force of a revelation. Belonging to this group meant disappearing. It meant erasing herself until she was just a reflection of Chloe. Amelia's grip on the sketchbook tightened until her knuckles turned the color of bone. The noise of the hallway seemed to fade into a dull, distant roar. She took a breath. It was shaky, but it was deep. She turned back to Chloe, her eyes lifting from the floor to meet the gaze that had terrified the entire 8th grade. She didn't shout. She didn't scream. She simply spoke the truth that had been forming in her heart for weeks. "No," she whispered. Chloe blinked, confusion rippling across her face. "Excuse me?" Amelia stood taller. "I said no. I'm not throwing it away, and I'm not sitting with you on Monday." She paused and then delivered the sentence that would sever the cord forever. "Because I don't want to be like you." The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and terrifying. The girls behind Chloe gasped. Chloe stared, her mouth opening slightly, the shock of the rejection momentarily breaking her composure. But then the shock hardened. Her eyes narrowed into slits of icy fury. She didn't explode. She smiled. It was a cold, dangerous smile that promised retribution. "Okay," Chloe said softly. "Have it your way." She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Amelia standing in the wreckage of her social life, free and terrified. The moment Chloe walked away, the atmosphere in the hallway didn't just return to normal, it curdled. You might think that standing up to a bully results in a round of applause, like in the movies where the underdog speaks her truth and the crowd cheers. But in the real architecture of 8th grade, the reaction to rebellion isn't celebration, it's quarantine. Amelia stood by her locker, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, and watched the ecosystem of the school recoil from her. It was instantaneous and brutal. She had become a social contagion, a carrier of a virus called defiance, and the only cure for the rest of the student body was total isolation. The first thing she noticed was the silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of an empty room. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a room full of people pretending you don't exist. As Amelia gathered her books and began the long walk to her next class, she stepped into a phenomenon that victims of bullying know intimately: the giggle silence. It's a sophisticated weapon of psychological warfare, far more effective than name-calling because it leaves no bruises and offers no proof. Here is how it works. Amelia would walk toward a group of students chattering by a water fountain. As she approached, the conversation would die instantly, cut off mid-sentence like a radio cord had been pulled. Eyes would avert, heads would turn to study the floor tiles or the ceiling. She would walk through this vacuum of sound, the clicking of her own shoes the only noise in the corridor, feeling the physical weight of their withheld attention. Then, the moment, the exact second, she passed them and was out of earshot, the laughter would erupt. It was sharp, loud, and performative. It wasn't about a joke, it was a signal. It told her, "We are talking about you, and you aren't allowed to know what we're saying." It created a paranoia that settled deep in her stomach, a constant gnawing question of what was being mocked. Her walk? Her clothes? Her existence? Walking to 3rd period felt less like navigating a school and more like crossing a minefield. The hallway, usually a chaotic river of bodies, seemed to part around her. But it wasn't the parting of the Red Sea for a leader, it was the wide berth given to a leper. Amelia kept her head high, clutching her sketchbook to her chest like a shield, but her peripheral vision was screaming. She saw the nudges, she saw the whispers behind cupped hands, she saw the eyes that tracked her progress and then darted away the moment she looked back. The most painful part wasn't the cruelty of Chloe's inner circle, it was the cowardice of the neutrals. These were the kids Amelia had known for years, the girl who borrowed her math notes, the boy who sat behind her in English and made jokes about the teacher. These weren't enemies, they were casual acquaintances, the background characters of her school life. But now, as she passed them, they developed a sudden, intense fascination with their shoelaces. They saw the target painted on her back, and their survival instinct kicked in. To acknowledge Amelia was to risk infection. If they smiled at her, Chloe might see. If they said hello, they might be next. So they sacrificed her. They chose their own safety over her dignity, looking right through her as if she were made of glass. It was a cold, silent betrayal that hurt far more than any insult Chloe could have shouted. By the time Amelia reached the girls' bathroom on the second floor, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely turn the handle. She slipped inside, the heavy door clicking shut behind her, cutting off the murmur of the hallway. The bathroom was empty, smelling faintly of bleach and cheap soap. It was the only sanctuary left. She moved to the farthest stall, locked it, and sat on the closed lid of the toilet, finally letting the breath rush out of her lungs. She pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself as small as possible. The adrenaline that had fueled her defiance at the lockers was draining away, leaving behind a hollow, aching exhaustion. She traced the grout lines on the wall with her eyes, trying to stabilize the world. She had done the right thing. She knew she had. She had saved her soul from being paved over by Chloe's expectations. But sitting there in the cold, tiled silence, the cost of that victory felt unbearable. She was herself again, yes, but she was entirely, utterly alone. The silence of the bathroom wasn't peaceful. It was the sound of exile. And she knew, with a sinking dread, that the silence was just the beginning. Outside this door, the noise was gathering, and it was going to be weaponized. If the hallway was a minefield, the classroom was a cage match where the referee was legally blind. Silence in the corridors was one thing. You could keep moving, keep your head down, and eventually reach a destination. But in a classroom, you were trapped. You were a captive audience to your own dismantling. The venue for the next phase of Amelia's punishment was fourth period English, a class that required active participation and peer collaboration. Phrases that sound educational in a syllabus, but translate to social warfare in middle school. The teacher, Mrs. Gable, was a kind woman who wore cardigan sweaters and believed deeply in the goodness of children. She was the perfect accomplice for a bully like Chloe because she couldn't imagine malice unless it was shouted. She didn't understand that the cruelest things are often said at a normal volume, disguised as insight. The class was discussing character motivation in the novel they were reading. The discussion had drifted, as it often did, to the concept of fitting in. It was a topic that practically handed Chloe a loaded weapon. When she raised her hand, the charm bracelet on her wrist jingled, a sound that Pavlov would have recognized as a signal for incoming aggression. "I think," Chloe began, her voice smooth and thoughtful, turning in her seat so she could address the room while keeping Amelia in her direct line of sight, "that sometimes characters isolate themselves because they think they're better than everyone else. It's not that people don't want to include them. It's that they reject the community because they're arrogant. They think their little hobbies are more important than people." The room went still. The subtext was so loud it was practically screaming. Every student in the room knew exactly who Chloe was talking about. They shifted in their seats, eyes darting from Chloe to Amelia, waiting for the impact. Mrs. Gable nodded enthusiastically, completely missing the missile that had just been launched. "That's an interesting perspective, Chloe. So you think isolation can be a choice based on superiority?" "Exactly," Chloe smiled, her eyes locked on Amelia. "It's like, if you think you're too good to talk to people, or if you think your private world is so much more special than the real world, you're basically insulting everyone around you. It's selfish, really." Amelia sat frozen. The accusation was brilliant in its cruelty. It took her shyness, her anxiety, and her artistic retreat and twisted them into sins. It framed her survival mechanism as an act of aggression. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, to explain that she didn't think she was better, she was just terrified. But her throat felt like it was filled with cement. To speak would be to validate the attack. To speak would be to look defensive. So she stared at her desk, feeling the heat rise up her neck, burning her skin. But words were only the opening volley. The physical violation came next. As the bell rang to end the discussion, the class erupted into the chaotic shuffle of packing up. Amelia moved quickly, desperate to escape the suffocating air of the room. She had her sketchbook on the corner of her desk, her constant companion, her shield. Chloe, moving with the calculated grace of a predator, walked past Amelia's row. She didn't shove Amelia. That would be too obvious. That would get her sent to the principal's office. Instead, as she passed, her designer tote bag swung out in a wide, seemingly natural arc. It collided with the sketchbook. The book didn't just fall, it flew. It hit the linoleum floor with a heavy, flat smack that cut through the chatter of the room. It landed open. A charcoal drawing of a girl with no mouth, standing alone in a crowd of faceless figures, was exposed to the harsh fluorescent light. "Oops," Chloe said. The word was devoid of apology. It was flat, bored, and dripping with satisfaction. She looked down at the drawing and then let out a short, derisive laugh. "Wow, subtle." Mrs. Gable looked up from her desk, frowning slightly. "Chloe, be careful with your bag. Amelia, please pick up your things. We need to clear the room for the next class." The injustice of it hit Amelia like a physical blow. The teacher saw a clumsy accident. The students saw a power move. And Amelia saw her private soul kicked onto the dirty floor. For a second, Amelia thought she might cry. The prickle of tears was there, hot and sharp behind her eyes. The urge to run was overwhelming. But then she looked at Chloe's face. She saw the anticipation there. Chloe was waiting for the tears. She was waiting for Amelia to scramble, to apologize, to break. Amelia took a slow breath. She pushed her chair back. She didn't scramble. She knelt down with a deliberate, agonizing slowness. She reached for the sketchbook, her hands steady despite the earthquake happening in her chest. She closed the cover, hiding the drawing, and stood up. She didn't look at the teacher. She didn't look at the floor. She looked directly at Chloe. She didn't say a word. She just held the book to her chest, turned, and walked out of the room. She had held on to her dignity. She hadn't given them the show they wanted. But as she stepped into the hallway, the adrenaline crashed. Her hands began to tremble violently. She had survived the public execution, but the damage was internal. The cracks in her armor weren't visible to the world yet, but she could feel them spreading, deep and irreparable, through the foundation of who she was. When Amelia finally unlocked her front door that afternoon, the sound of the deadbolt sliding into place didn't feel like safety. It felt like she was sealing herself inside a bunker. The house was quiet, filled with the late afternoon sun that slanted across the hardwood floors in lazy, golden rectangles. It was the same house it had been that morning, but Amelia felt like a stranger entering it. She dropped her backpack in the hallway. It hit the floor with a heavy thud, sounding like it was filled with stones rather than textbooks. That was the physical reality of the day. The emotional weight she had been carrying for 7 hours had finally settled into her muscles, making her limbs feel leaden and slow. She walked into the kitchen, where the domestic normalcy of her life was proceeding as if the world hadn't ended. Her mother was at the counter, chopping vegetables for dinner, the rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack of the knife against the wooden board providing a steady, comforting beat. The air smelled of sautéed onions and garlic, the smell of care, of family, of a world where people didn't destroy each other for sport. "Hey, sweetie," her mother said, not looking up from the celery. "How was school?" The question hung in the air, immense and terrible. How was school? How do you explain that school was a systematic dismantling of your identity? How do you tell your mother that you are currently radioactive and that your dignity is bleeding out on a linoleum floor? Amelia stood in the doorway, the truth rising in her throat like bile. She wanted to say it. She wanted to collapse onto the cool tile floor and weep until there was nothing left. She wanted her mother to fix it, to call the school, to make the cruelty stop. But she looked at her mother's tired shoulders, curved over the cutting board after her own long day at work. She thought about what would happen if she spoke. The phone calls, the meetings, the concerned parent intervention that would only paint a brighter, larger target on Amelia's back. Adults think they can fix social wars with mediation and apologies, but they don't understand that their involvement is the nuclear option. If her mother intervened, Amelia wouldn't just be an outcast, she would be a snitch, a baby. So Amelia swallowed the truth. She pushed it down into the pit of her stomach where the anxiety lived. "It was fine," she said. Her voice sounded thin, like paper, but her mother didn't seem to notice. "Good," her mother said, scraping the vegetables into a pan. "Wash up, dinner's in 20. Amelia retreated to her bedroom, closing the door and leaning back against it, closing her eyes. This was the hardest part of the siege. At school, the enemy was external, Chloe, the giggling girls, the silent bystanders. But alone in her room, the enemy was inside her own head. The adrenaline of the confrontation had faded, leaving behind a cold, creeping doubt. She looked at herself in the vanity mirror. The girl staring back looked exhausted. Her skin was pale, her eyes dark. And the voice in her head, the one that usually narrated her artistic ideas, began to sound suspiciously like Chloe. "Maybe you are the problem," the voice whispered. "Maybe you are arrogant. Who do you think you are trying to be different? Is it really so hard to just wear the right clothes and laugh at the right jokes? Is your pride worth this misery? The temptation to surrender was a physical ache. It would be so easy. She could pull out her phone right now. She could text Chloe, "I'm sorry, you were right. I was having a bad day. I want to fit in." She could throw the sketchbook in the trash, take a picture of it in the bin, and send it as proof of her loyalty. The pain would stop. The silence in the hallway would end. She would be welcomed back, not as a queen, but as a subject, protected by the crown. She looked over at her desk where the sketchbook lay. The cover was bent from the fall in English class. It looked pathetic, small, useless. Was this stack of paper really worth the social suicide of her entire 8th grade year? Was a drawing of a bird or a shadow worth the crushing loneliness of the cafeteria? Amelia sat on the edge of her bed, her phone in one hand, the screen glowing in the dimming light. She pulled up Chloe's contact. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard. She was one sentence away from ending the war, one sentence away from peace. But she knew, with a terrifying clarity, that peace would come at the cost of her soul. It was the darkest hour of the night, where resolve feels like foolishness, and giving up feels like the only rational choice a person can make. Monday morning arrived with the inevitability of a tidal wave. Amelia had spent the weekend in a state of suspended animation, dreading the moment she would have to step back into the building that had become her prison. When the lunch bell finally rang, signaling the hour she feared most, she didn't even glance toward the cafeteria. The cafeteria was a theater of war, a place where seating arrangements were political statements, and solitude was a public admission of defeat. Instead, she headed for the library. The library was the one place in the school where silence was mandatory, not punitive. It smelled of dust and binding glue, a dry, ancient scent that felt safer than the vanilla and fear perfume of the hallway. Amelia found a table in the back corner, hidden behind a towering stack of encyclopedias that hadn't been opened since the internet was invented. She sat with her back to the wall, a strategic necessity she had learned from nature documentaries about prey animals. She opened her sketchbook, not to draw, but to have something to look at, a prop to justify her existence in the chair. She had been sitting there for 10 minutes, listening to the hum of the air conditioner and the frantic beating of her own heart, when she heard it. The sound of a chair scraping against the carpet. It came from her table. Amelia froze. Her muscles locked up, a physical flinch born of the absolute certainty that this was an ambush. She didn't look up. She stared at the blank page of her book, waiting for the voice. She waited for Chloe's syrupy sweetness or the sharp giggle of a lieutenant. She waited for the mockery that would inevitably follow the invasion of her sanctuary. Her mind raced through the possibilities. Were they going to pour something on her? Were they going to take the book again? She gripped her charcoal pencil so hard her fingers turned white, bracing for the impact. But the voice didn't come. Instead, there was the heavy thud of a backpack hitting the floor, followed by the rustle of a paper bag being opened. Slowly, agonizingly, Amelia lifted her eyes. Sitting diagonally across from her was not Chloe. It wasn't one of the popular girls. It was a boy named Marcus. Amelia knew him only as the kid who sat in the back of her history class, usually wearing headphones around his neck and a hoodie that looked like it had been through a war. He was a floater, one of those students who existed in the gaps between social groups, unbothered and unnoticed. He didn't look at her. He pulled a sandwich out of his bag, opened a comic book, and started to read. Amelia's confusion was absolute. The rules of the quarantine were clear. Amelia was radioactive. To sit near her was to risk contamination. Surely Marcus knew this. Surely he had seen the way the hallway parted around her. She watched him, waiting for the punchline. Was he doing this on a dare? Was someone filming this from the stacks? She scanned the room, looking for the camera, looking for the trap. But Marcus just ate his sandwich. He turned a page of his comic. He took a sip of water. He was aggressively, beautifully normal. The silence between them wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the hallway. It was just quiet. It was the companionable silence of two people occupying the same space without demanding anything from each other. After 5 minutes, the tension in Amelia's shoulders began to unknot, replaced by a bewildering sense of relief. And then, Marcus moved. He reached into his backpack and rummaged around for a solid 30 seconds, the sound of shifting papers loud in the quiet corner. Finally, he looked up. He looked directly at Amelia. She braced herself again. Here it comes, she thought. The insult. Hey, Marcus whispered. His voice was rusty, like he hadn't used it all day. Do you have a sharpener? Mine exploded. Amelia stared at him. A sharpener. He wanted a sharpener. It was such a mundane, practical request that her brain struggled to process it. She nodded, her movements stiff, and reached into her pencil case. She pulled out her small metal sharpener and slid it across the table. Marcus took it. Thanks. He sharpened his pencil over a napkin. The sound of the wood shaving away was rhythmic and grounding. When he was finished, he slid the sharpener back, but he didn't immediately return to his comic. He held her gaze for a second longer than necessary. By the way, he said, his voice low, pitched so only she could hear. I saw what happened at the lockers on Friday. Amelia's stomach dropped. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to crawl under the table. You were right, Marcus said simply. He shrugged, a small, jerky motion of his shoulders. Chloe is a lot. Most people are too scared to say anything. It was cool that you did. He didn't wait for a response. He didn't ask to be her best friend. He didn't offer to start a revolution. He just picked up his comic book and went back to reading, as if he hadn't just handed her a lifeline in the middle of a drowning ocean. Amelia sat there, staring at the sharpener that was now back in her possession. It was just a small piece of metal, but it felt heavy with significance. She wasn't invisible. And more importantly, she wasn't wrong. Someone else had seen the truth. Someone else had witnessed her refusal and interpreted it not as social suicide, but as bravery. She looked at Marcus, who was chewing his sandwich and ignoring her completely. A warmth spread through her chest, small but fierce. It was the first crack in the wall of isolation Chloe had built around her. The bullies relied on the illusion that everyone agreed with them, that their power was total and unanimous. But here, in the dusty corner of the library, was proof that the consensus was a lie. Amelia picked up her charcoal. She didn't draw a faceless figure this time. She started to sketch the stack of books on the table, the strong, straight lines of the spines. Her hand was steady. The fear was still there, lurking at the edges of her mind, but it was no longer the only thing in the room. She wasn't alone. And as she shaded the cover of a book, she realized something profound. Strength is contagious. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just sits down at your table and asks to borrow a sharpener. The library had offered Amelia safety, a temporary ceasefire in the middle of a war zone. But safety is not the same thing as strength. You can survive in a bunker, but you cannot live there. To live, you need to claim space. You need to make a noise. And for Amelia, whose voice had been silenced by the collective judgment of the 8th grade, her noise was made with graphite and charcoal. The following day, during the lunch hour that had become her daily gauntlet, Amelia bypassed the library. She walked past the cafeteria doors, ignoring the roar of conversation that sounded like a physical threat, and turned down the quiet corridor that led to the art wing. Room 104. The moment she crossed the threshold, the atmosphere shifted. The air here didn't smell of anxiety, cheap body spray, or the metallic tang of lockers. It smelled of turpentine, dried clay, and the sharp, chemical bite of acrylic paint. It was a messy, chaotic smell, and to Amelia, it was the scent of oxygen. Mrs. Vance was at the sink, scrubbing out a set of hardened paintbrushes with the vigorous determination of someone trying to save a lost cause. She was wearing a smock covered in a constellation of stains, blues, ochres, and crimsons that marked the history of 100 student projects. She looked up as Amelia entered. Mrs. Vance was one of those rare teachers who understood that sometimes a student doesn't need a lecture or a counseling session. Sometimes they just need a place to be. She saw the tension in Amelia's shoulders, the way she held her backpack like a shield. She didn't ask, "Are you okay?" She didn't ask, "Why aren't you eating with your friends?" She simply nodded, a quick, sharp gesture of acknowledgement, and turned off the faucet. "The good paper is in the flat file," Mrs. Vance said, drying her hands on a rag. "Don't use the cheap stuff today. You look like you need the heavy grain." That was it. No interrogation, just permission. Amelia felt a knot in her chest loosen, a physical release of pressure that made her lightheaded. She went to the flat file drawers and pulled out a large sheet of cream-colored paper, the kind with a toothy texture that grabbed onto charcoal and refused to let go. She taped it to a drawing board and carried it to the back of the room, near the windows where the dust motes danced in the slanted light. For weeks, Chloe had demanded that Amelia become a blank canvas. That was the core of the bullying, the demand to be erased. Chloe wanted Amelia to sand down her edges, cover up her quirks, and present a smooth, reflective surface that showed the world only what it wanted to see. Being normal meant being empty. It meant being a vessel for other people's expectations. But as Amelia picked up a thick stick of compressed charcoal, she realized that she was done being empty. She didn't draw a flower. She didn't draw a landscape or a bowl of fruit. She attacked the paper. She pressed the charcoal down with a force that snapped the stick in two, the sound sharp and satisfying in the quiet room. She drew the hallway, but not the hallway as it looked in a photograph. She drew the hallway as it felt. She drew lockers that loomed like skyscrapers, bending inward to crush the small figures walking between them. She drew the air as a thick, swirling fog of dark lines, a tangible weight that pressed down on the shoulders of a girl standing alone in the center. Her hands got dirty. The black dust coated her fingertips, smudged her palms, and worked its way under her nails. It was messy. It was the exact opposite of Chloe's manicured, pristine perfection. And in that mess, Amelia found her answer. Chloe had called her weird as if it were a diagnosis, a terminal condition that needed to be cured. But staring at the bold, angry, beautiful lines forming on the paper, Amelia understood that weird was just a lazy word for perspective. To be weird is to see the world from an angle that no one else can access. It is to have a voice that doesn't harmonize with the chorus because it is singing a different song. Chloe had tried to shame her for her art, for her retreat into her sketchbook, because Chloe feared what she couldn't understand. Chloe lived on the surface, where everything was shiny and fragile. Amelia lived in the deep, where things were messy and real. She shaded the figure in the drawing, giving her a shadow that stretched out long and unbroken, anchoring her to the ground. The figure wasn't hiding. She was standing. She was witnessing. The act of creating this image was an act of defiance far more powerful than any retort she could have shouted in the cafeteria. By putting her reality onto the paper, Amelia was proving that she existed. She was proving that her pain, her fear, and her resilience were real things that took up space in the world. The bell rang, signaling the end of the period, but Amelia didn't jump. She wiped her hands on her jeans, leaving dark smears against the denim, another violation of the dress code, another badge of honor. She looked at the drawing. It was dark, heavy, and undeniably true. She wasn't building a wall to hide behind anymore. She was building a fortress, not of stone, but of self. And for the first time since the confrontation at the lockers, she felt safe. Not because the danger was gone, but because she remembered who she was. Power, when it is threatened, does not go quietly. It screams, it thrashes, it demands to be recognized. Chloe had spent a week trying to bury Amelia under the weight of silence and humiliation, but Amelia hadn't disappeared. She was still there, sitting in the library with Marcus, drawing in the art room, walking through the halls with her head high. For a personality like Chloe's, which required total submission to function, Amelia's continued existence was an intolerable provocation. Silence hadn't worked. Shame hadn't worked. So, Chloe decided to burn the whole theater down. The second test didn't happen in the relative privacy of a classroom or a hallway. It happened in the cafeteria, the coliseum of the middle school experience, where every interaction is magnified by the presence of 300 witnesses. It was Pizza Friday, the loudest day of the week, but the noise level dropped with unnatural speed as Chloe marched toward the table where Amelia was sitting. She wasn't strolling this time. She was storming. Chloe slammed her hands down on the laminate table, the sound echoing like a gavel. Her face was flushed, her eyes bright with a frantic, brittle energy. She didn't have a prop this time, no headband, no sketchbook to kick. She had something more volatile, a fabrication. "I know what you're doing," Chloe announced, her voice pitched to reach the back of the room. "I know you're spreading rumors about me. Jessica told me everything." It was a classic trap, the unnamed source accusation. It was designed to do two things: force Amelia to deny it, which would make her look defensive and guilty, or force her to attack Jessica, which would make her look mean. It was a setup intended to provoke a public outburst. Chloe needed Amelia to scream. She needed Amelia to cry. She needed Amelia to lose control, so that Chloe could point a finger and say, "See, she's crazy. She's the problem. I'm the victim." Amelia looked up from her tray. A month ago, this confrontation would have stopped her heart. She would have stammered, apologized for things she hadn't done, and begged for forgiveness. But a month is a long time when you are rebuilding your soul from scratch. Amelia looked at Chloe, but for the first time, she didn't see a queen. She didn't see a monster. She saw a girl who was trembling. It was a subtle thing, visible only to someone who spent her life observing the smallest details. Chloe's hands, pressed against the table, were shaking. Her breathing was shallow. There was a desperate, wild fear behind her eyes. Amelia realized with a sudden, jarring clarity that Chloe wasn't angry. She was terrified. She was terrified because her entire sense of self was built on the fragile foundation of other people's fear. If Amelia wasn't afraid, then Chloe wasn't powerful. And if Chloe wasn't powerful, who was she? The silence in the cafeteria was absolute. 300 students held their breath, waiting for the explosion. They waited for Amelia to fight back or to fold. Amelia did neither. She slowly put down her fork. She didn't stand up to meet Chloe's aggression. She stayed seated, grounding herself in her own space. She looked at Chloe not with hatred, but with a profound, quiet pity. It was the look you might give a trapped bird throwing itself against a window pane, sadness that it couldn't see the open door. "I haven't said anything about you, Chloe," Amelia said. Her voice was calm, steady, and loud enough to be heard without shouting. "I don't talk about you at all." The words hit the air with the force of a physical blow, precisely because they were so gentle. It wasn't an insult, it was a statement of fact. "I don't talk about you." It was the ultimate dismissal. It dismantled Chloe's main delusion, that she was the center of everyone's universe. "You're lying!" Chloe shrieked, her voice cracking, losing the smooth, controlled timbre she usually cultivated. "You're obsessed with me. You're trying to ruin my life because you're a jealous little freak." The insults were sharp, but they landed harmlessly. Amelia could see them for what they were, defensive flares fired from a sinking ship. The audience, the silent hundreds watching the exchange, felt the shift too. They saw Amelia sitting calmly, her hands folded in her lap, and they saw Chloe unraveling, screaming at a girl who wasn't fighting back. The illusion of Chloe's perfection shattered. She didn't look like a leader anymore. She looked mean. She looked desperate. She looked small. "I'm not jealous," Amelia said softly. She looked at Chloe's entourage, who were shifting uncomfortably behind their leader, eyes downcast. Then she looked back at Chloe. "I'm just tired of the game. Aren't you?" It was a question that cut to the bone. "Aren't you tired?" For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped completely, and Amelia saw the exhaustion on Chloe's face, the sheer crushing weight of maintaining the cruelty. But then the walls slammed back up. Chloe scoffed, a harsh, ugly sound, and spun around. "Whatever," Chloe snapped. "You're not worth my time." She walked away, but the exit didn't have her usual swagger. It was too fast, too jerky. It was a retreat. And as she walked away, the cafeteria didn't return to its normal roar immediately. The silence lingered, but the texture of it had changed. It wasn't fearful anymore. It was thoughtful. The meanest girl in the 8th grade had brought her biggest weapon, public humiliation, and it had failed. She had tried to manufacture a monster, but she had only revealed herself. Amelia picked up her fork. Her hand was trembling slightly, just a little, but she took a bite of her lunch. She had survived the second test. And looking around the room, catching the eyes of students who quickly looked away, not in fear but in embarrassment, she knew the war was over. Chloe still had the crown, perhaps, but she had lost the kingdom. The cafeteria confrontation didn't end with a cheer or a slow clap. Real life rarely offers such neat cinematic endings. Instead, it ended with a shift in gravity. In the days that followed, the strict, unspoken laws that Chloe had written for the 8th grade began to dissolve. It wasn't a mutiny. It was a drift. The students who had previously orbited Chloe with terrified devotion began to widen their circles. They realized that the penalty for looking away wasn't social death, it was freedom. The spell of absolute control is fragile. It requires constant maintenance and universal fear. Once Amelia proved that you could look the tyrant in the eye and survive, the fear evaporated, leaving Chloe looking less like a queen and more like a girl who was just trying too hard. Amelia didn't suddenly become popular in the way the movies define it. She wasn't invited to the high-status parties, and she didn't suddenly start wearing the trendiest clothes. She remained the quiet girl with the sketchbook, but the quality of the silence around her changed. It was no longer the silence of exclusion, it was the silence of respect. When she walked down the hall, people didn't part like she was contagious. They nodded. They held doors. A boy in her science class picked up a dropped eraser and handed it back to her with a genuine smile, a small act of human decency that would have been impossible a week prior because of the risk of association. These were micro-revolutions, tiny acts of defiance against the old regime of fear. But the most important repair work had to happen closer to home. On a Wednesday, 3 days after the cafeteria incident, Amelia found herself standing near the bike racks after school. Sarah was there, struggling with a combination lock that always stuck in the rain. Sarah, whom Amelia had looked through as if she were made of glass. Sarah, who had been labeled a social liability by a girl who didn't know the first thing about loyalty. Amelia felt the old shame rise up, hot and prickly. It would have been easier to walk past, to let the distance between them remain a permanent scar. But Amelia had learned that comfort is often the enemy of integrity. She walked over. She didn't have a prepared speech. She didn't have a grand excuse. She just stood there, watching Sarah wrestle with the stubborn metal dial. "It's right, left, right," Amelia said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "But you have to jiggle it on the last turn." Sarah froze. She didn't turn around immediately. The tension stretched tight between them, a fragile wire holding the weight of the betrayal. Then, slowly, Sarah turned. Her eyes searched Amelia's face, looking for the girl who had practiced a fake laugh in the mirror. She didn't find her. She found the old Amelia, the one who knew about thunderstorms and peanut butter sandwiches. "I thought you forgot how to open it," Sarah said. Her voice was guarded, but there was no malice in it. "I forgot a lot of things," Amelia admitted, looking at her shoes. "I'm sorry. I was trying to be someone else. And she was terrible." Sarah looked at her for a long moment, and then a small, real smile broke through. "Yeah, she was. Your hair looked weird pulled back like that anyway." "I know," Amelia laughed, and this time, the sound came from her chest, not her throat. It was her real laugh. "It gave me a headache." They walked home together, the silence between them comfortable and filled with the unspoken understanding that the breach had been healed. Amelia realized then that true influence isn't about controlling who sits where or who wears what. True influence is the courage to be authentic enough that other people feel safe doing the same. By refusing to be a copy, Amelia had given everyone else permission to be original. The storm of middle school politics had passed, and while the landscape was different, scattered with the debris of broken alliances and shattered egos, the ground beneath Amelia's feet finally felt solid. She wasn't standing on a stage anymore. She was standing on the earth. The months that followed the cafeteria incident didn't bring a sudden revolution, but they brought a thaw. 8th grade, with all its sharp edges and hidden trapdoors, continued its slow, inevitable march toward graduation. The snow melted into the muddy slush of March and eventually gave way to the pale green promise of April. But the atmosphere inside the school had fundamentally shifted. The hierarchy that Chloe had so carefully constructed, a pyramid built on insecurity, silence, and the fear of being different, had lost its structural integrity. It didn't collapse overnight in a heap of rubble. It just ceased to be the only thing that mattered to anyone. Amelia navigated these final months with a new kind of quiet. Before, her silence had been a hiding place, a desperate attempt to blend into the beige lockers and linoleum floors to avoid detection. Now, her silence was a choice. It was a peaceful, observant quiet that belonged to her. She still sat in the library or the art room during lunch, often with Marcus or Sarah, but she no longer felt the need to shrink when she walked down the main corridor. She wore her paint-stained jeans with pride. She let her bangs grow out until they were messy and comfortable, framing her face rather than hiding it. She stopped checking her reflection in every glass surface to see if she was acceptable, because she finally understood that acceptance wasn't something you rented from others. It was something you built, brick by brick, within yourself. The giggle silence that had once plagued her walks to class had evaporated. In its place was a kind of neutral respect. The students who had once looked through her now offered small, tentative nods. They were the survivors of the same war, waking up to the realization that the enemy had only ever been their own fear. Amelia even caught a few younger girls, 6th graders with terrified eyes, looking at her as she passed. She made sure to smile at them, a real smile, to let them know that the hallway wasn't a death sentence. Chloe was still there, of course. She still sat at the center table, surrounded by girls who laughed a little too loudly at her jokes and nodded a little too quickly at her opinions. But the magnetic pull was gone. The gravity had shifted. Amelia would see her in the hallway, adjusting a friend's collar with that familiar possessiveness, or whispering a critique about someone's shoes, and feel nothing. No fear, no envy, no anger. Chloe had become just another student, a girl trapped in an exhausting performance that no one was really watching anymore. One afternoon, their eyes met across the crowded gym during an assembly. For a heartbeat, the old challenge flared in Chloe's gaze, but Amelia didn't flinch. She just looked back, calm and settled, until Chloe looked away first. The power dynamic had dissolved because Amelia had stopped playing the game. When you refuse to buy what the bully is selling, they go bankrupt. The art room became Amelia's true classroom. Under Mrs. Vance's guidance, her sketchbook filled up not just with drawings of isolation, but with studies of connection and resilience. She drew Sarah's hands, strong and capable, working a combination lock. She drew Marcus reading his comic book, the lines of his posture relaxed and unbothered by the world. She drew the way the light hit the dust motes in the library, turning them into gold. She realized that her weirdness, her intensity, her observation, her refusal to skim the surface, was actually her superpower. The world is full of people who are willing to be copies, to trace over the lines someone else drew for them. To be an original is lonely work, but the view is better. On the last day of school, the hallway was a chaotic riot of signing yearbooks and slamming lockers. The air smelled of freedom and summer heat. Amelia stood at locker 314, the site of her great rebellion. She packed a last of her books into her bag. She looked at the metal door where she had once stood trembling, terrified of a girl who was just as scared as she was. She ran her hand over the cool metal, feeling the dents and scratches of the year. She hadn't changed the world. She hadn't toppled a regime or become the prom queen. But as she slung her backpack over one shoulder, she realized she had done something far more difficult. She had saved her own life. She had walked through the fire of social rejection and come out the other side with her name, her face, and her soul intact. Amelia pushed open the double doors and stepped out into the blinding June sunlight. She didn't look back at the school, and she didn't look down at her feet. She just walked, the sketchbook heavy and solid in her hand, heading toward a future that belonged entirely to her. If you've ever had to choose between fitting in and being real, tell me your story in the comments. Subscribe for more echoes of courage from the quiet ones.